One careless moment, one false step, and 3 people were trapped.
The Bigamist didn't play by Hollywood's rules. It couldn't. A woman directed it. A woman starred in it. And the story, it dared to ask questions polite society wouldn't touch. Marriage, morality, and what happens when one man loves 2 women. These are 20 weird facts about the Bigamist. And hidden in the shadows, a director who fought the system so hard, she nearly vanished from history entirely. Buckle up. This confession gets dark fast. Number 1. In 1953, Hollywood had exactly 2 female directors working in major studios. Ida Lupino was one of them. But she didn't wait for permission. She didn't schmooze executives or play politics. She started her own production company, The Filmmakers, with her husband Collier Young. No big budget, no studio backing, just grit and a typewriter. The Bigamist was her 4th feature as director, and it came with a challenge nobody saw coming. The male lead, Edmund O'Brien, had just worked on a big-budget MGM picture. He was used to massive crews, endless takes, perfect lighting. Then he showed up to Lupino's set, 12 crew members, borrowed cameras, locations shot guerrilla style on actual Los Angeles streets. O'Brien looked around, confused. Where's the rest of the team? Lupino smiled. This is it. Welcome to independent filmmaking. O'Brien later admitted he almost walked away. But something about Lupino's confidence, her clarity, made him stay. She didn't just direct the film, she rewrote Hollywood's playbook, proving you didn't need a studio's blessing to tell a story that mattered. And in doing so, she became one of the most important filmmakers nobody remembers. Number 2. The premise alone should have killed the project before it started. A man married to 2 different women, neither knowing about the other. In 1953, that wasn't just scandalous, it was moral dynamite. The production code, Hollywood's censorship board, had strict rules. No adultery, no sympathy for lawbreakers, no moral ambiguity. The Bigamist broke every single one. But Lupino had a strategy. She didn't glorify bigamy. She humanized it. Her script painted Harry Graham not as a villain, but as a deeply flawed man caught between 2 lives he couldn't reconcile. The code reviewers read it, expecting exploitation. What they got was empathy, and that confused them. They couldn't ban it outright because technically the film condemned the behavior. But they couldn't approve it either because it asked audiences to understand rather than judge. After weeks of back and forth, they gave it a reluctant pass with one warning. If audiences sympathize too much, we'll pull it from theaters. Lupino didn't care. She'd already won. The film got made, got released, and got people talking. In an era where morality was black and white, the Bigamist dared to exist in shades of gray. And that terrified everyone.
Shocking story of 2 women who gave all their love.
Number 3. Joan Fontaine was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. An Oscar winner, Hitchcock's leading lady, elegant, refined, untouchable. So when she signed on to play Eve Graham, the loyal first wife, people assumed she'd phone it in, a paycheck role in a low-budget indie. But Fontaine did something unexpected. She asked Ida Lupino if she could watch the directing process between her scenes. Not to interfere, just to learn. Lupino said yes. And what started as curiosity became something deeper. Fontaine saw how Lupino worked with actors, how she framed shots, how she built emotion without dialogue. She watched Lupino handle a 15-person crew like a general commanding an army. And she realized something. This wasn't just a director. This was a woman rewriting the rules in real time. Years later, Fontaine admitted the Bigamist changed how she thought about Hollywood. Not because of the script or the paycheck, but because for the first time, she saw what was possible when a woman controlled the camera. She never directed a film herself, but she credited Lupino with showing her that power didn't always come from being in front of the lens. Sometimes it came from standing behind it.
Pictures proudly presents Joan Fontaine.
Number 4. Here's where it gets strange. Ida Lupino wasn't just the director. She was also the 2nd female lead, playing Phyllis Martin, the lonely woman Harry falls for in San Francisco. That meant she had to direct herself in deeply emotional scenes. Most directors avoid acting in their own films because it's nearly impossible to judge your own performance while managing everyone else. But Lupino didn't have a choice. The budget was so tight, hiring another actress wasn't an option. So she developed a system. She'd block the scene, rehearse with Edmund O'Brien, then step in front of the camera and perform. After each take, she'd run to the monitor, watch playback, make notes, then shoot again. The crew watched in disbelief. She was directing, acting, and essentially editing in real time. O'Brien said it was like watching someone play chess against themselves and somehow winning. But the strangest part wasn't the multitasking. It was the performance itself. Lupino gave Phyllis a quiet desperation, a loneliness so raw it felt like she was channeling something personal. Because she was. Lupino knew what it felt like to be underestimated, overlooked, invisible, and she poured all of that into a character who just wanted to be seen. On screen, it's heartbreaking. Behind the camera, it was survival.
Are you sure you want me?
Number 5. The film was shot in just 18 days. Not 18 weeks, 18 days. That's faster than most TV episodes. Lupino had no choice. The budget was $165,000, a fraction of what major studios spent on a single set piece. Every day cost money they didn't have. So, Lupino planned like a military operation. She storyboarded every shot in advance, blocking scenes on paper before actors even arrived. She used natural light whenever possible to save on equipment. She shot scenes out of order based on location availability, not narrative flow. And she demanded perfection on the first or second take because there was no time for 10. The crew worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer. Edmund O'Brien said he'd never moved so fast on a set. Joan Fontaine called it organized chaos. But Lupino kept it together. She didn't yell, she didn't panic, she just moved forward, shot by shot, scene by scene. And on day 18, when they wrapped the final scene, the crew stood in silence. Not because they were exhausted, though they were, but because they just witnessed something rare. A film born from pure determination, shot against all odds, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Speed didn't kill the quality, it sharpened it. Number 6. Collier Young wasn't just Ida Lupino's producing partner, he was her ex-husband. They'd divorced 2 years before The Bigamist went into production. And here's where it gets complicated. Young had remarried to actress Joan Fontaine, the same Joan Fontaine now starring opposite Lupino in a film about a man torn between two women. On paper, it should have been a disaster. The ex-wife directing the new wife in a story about fractured marriages. Tensions should have exploded, egos should have clashed, but Lupino handled it with grace. She treated Fontaine with respect, giving her space to build the character without interference. Fontaine, in turn, never brought personal history to set. They kept it professional, focused, almost clinical, but cast and crew couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. When Lupino directed scenes of Harry torn between two lives, was she drawing from her own experience? When Fontaine played the devoted wife, was there subtext nobody dared mention, nobody asked, nobody had to? The subtext was woven into every frame. Art and life blurred in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. And yet, the film worked because of it, not in spite of it. Sometimes the best stories come from the most complicated truths. Number 7. Edmund O'Brien didn't want the role. When Lupino first approached him, he read the script and said no. Not because it was bad, but because it terrified him. Harry Graham wasn't a hero. He wasn't a charming rogue or a misunderstood anti-hero. He was just a man who made terrible choices and had to live with them. There was no redemption arc, no moment of triumph. Just guilt, consequences, and a slow unraveling. O'Brien told Lupino it was too depressing, too risky. Audiences wouldn't root for him. Critics would tear him apart. But Lupino didn't back down. She told him that's exactly why the role mattered. Because most films lie. They make complicated people simple. They give easy answers to hard questions. This film wouldn't do that. It would show a man at his worst and ask audiences to witness it without judgment. O'Brien thought about it for 3 days. Then he called her back and said yes. Not because he thought it would be successful, but because he knew it was honest, and honesty, even when it hurt, was worth something. Years later, O'Brien called it the hardest role he ever played, not physically, emotionally, because Harry Graham wasn't a monster. He was just human, and that made him impossible to hate and impossible to forgive.
And 3 people were...
Number 8. The courtroom scene at the end of the film, it wasn't supposed to exist. The original script ended differently, more ambiguous, more open-ended. But the production code demanded consequences. If Harry's bigamy went unpunished, the film wouldn't pass censorship. So, Lupino added the trial, but she did it on her terms. The courtroom isn't dramatic. There's no grand speech, no emotional breakdown. Harry sits quietly, defeated, while the legal system decides his fate. The camera lingers on faces, not words. The judge's ruling is barely audible, and when it ends, nothing feels resolved. Lupino shot it in one day, on a borrowed set, with minimal dialogue. She didn't rehearse it to death. She just let the actors sit in the silence, the weight of choices made, lives destroyed. When the code reviewers saw the final cut, they were furious. "This isn't a punishment," one reportedly said, "it's a tragedy." Lupino smiled. Exactly. Because the film wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about showing the cost of living a lie. And sometimes the cost isn't prison. It's knowing you destroyed everything you loved and there's no way back. The courtroom scene got approved, but it left audiences shaken. Not because justice was served, but because justice didn't feel like enough. Number 9. After The Bigamist premiered, something strange happened. Letters started arriving, not from critics or industry insiders, from real people. Women who'd been the second wife, the secret family. Men who'd lived double lives. Some letters were confessional, some were grateful, some were angry. But they all said the same thing. "You told our story." One letter came from a woman in Ohio. She wrote that she'd spent years as the other woman, believing her lover would leave his wife. He never did. When she saw The Bigamist, she wept through the entire film. Not because it was sad, but because for the first time, someone acknowledged her pain without judgment. Another letter came from a man in Texas. He admitted to living with 2 families for 7 years before getting caught. He said the film captured the crushing guilt he felt every single day. Lupino kept the letters private. She never discussed them publicly, never used them for publicity. But she saved every one, because they proved something she'd always believed. People don't want to be lectured. They want to be seen. And The Bigamist, for all its flaws and controversies, saw people nobody else dared to look at. Number 10. Critics didn't know what to do with The Bigamist. Some called it brave, groundbreaking, essential. Others called it exploitative, immoral, dangerous. But almost all of them ignored one crucial detail. It was directed by a woman. Reviews rarely mentioned Ida Lupino's role as director. When they did, it was often with condescension. Phrases like "surprisingly competent" or "handled delicately for a female touch" appeared in print. One review even credited the film's emotional depth to feminine intuition rather than directorial skill. Lupino read them all and said nothing publicly. But privately, she was furious. She hadn't fought her way into the director's chair to be patted on the head. She'd made a film about uncomfortable truths, moral ambiguity, and human failure, and instead of being judged on its merits, it was filtered through the lens of her gender. Years later, when film historians started reevaluating her work, they realized what 1953 critics missed. The Bigamist wasn't just a good film for a woman director. It was a masterpiece, period. Bold, unflinching, and decades ahead of its time. Lupino didn't make films like a woman. She made films like a visionary. And the fact that took 50 years to recognize says more about Hollywood than it does about her. Number 11. The film almost had a different title. The studio wanted to call it Two Lives, Two Loves, or The Double Life. Something softer, more romantic, less confrontational, something that sounded like a melodrama you could take your mother to see. But Ida Lupino refused. She dug in her heels and insisted on The Bigamist, because that's what the film was about. Not romance, not adventure, not a love triangle with a happy ending. A crime, a choice, a word that made people uncomfortable the second they heard it. The marketing department panicked. They held emergency meetings, drafted memos, presented research. They argued the title would drive audiences away, especially women, the core demographic for dramas in 1953. "Nobody wants to see a movie about a bigamist," one executive reportedly shouted. "It sounds sordid, illegal, immoral." Lupino disagreed. She believed honesty in advertising mattered more than ticket sales. If the title scared people off, good. That meant the ones who stayed, the ones who bought tickets anyway, would be ready for what they were about to see. No false promises, no bait and switch, just truth from the marquee to the final frame. The studio eventually caved, exhausted from fighting her, but with strict conditions. Posters couldn't show both women together. Taglines had to emphasize moral consequences, warning audiences this was a cautionary tale. And in some regions, particularly in the South and Midwest, theaters were instructed to add a disclaimer before screenings stating the film does not condone the behavior depicted. Lupino watched all of this unfold with quiet amusement, arms crossed, cigarette burning. They were so terrified of the word bigamist, yet the film itself was far more dangerous. Because it didn't just show bigamy, it asked why it happened. It humanized the crime. And that question, in 1953, was more threatening than any title ever could be. Number 12. There's a scene midway through the film where Harry visits Phyllis in her small San Francisco apartment. It's quiet, intimate, almost painfully real. No music, no dramatic lighting, just two people talking in a cramped room with peeling wallpaper. That scene was shot in an actual apartment, not a set. Lupino found it by driving through working-class neighborhoods until she spotted a building that felt right. She knocked on doors until she found a tenant willing to rent their space for a day. The production moved in with minimal equipment, a handheld camera, natural window light, and 2 actors. Joan Fontaine wasn't in that scene, but she visited the location out of curiosity. She later said it felt more like documentary filmmaking than Hollywood production. The tenant who rented the apartment stayed during filming, sitting quietly in the corner, watching. When they wrapped, Lupino thanked her and paid double what they had agreed. The woman asked why. Lupino said, "Because you let us tell the truth in your home, and truth costs more than fiction." That apartment scene became one of the most discussed moments in the film. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No theatrics, no manipulation. Just two people in a real space, making choices that would destroy lives.
One careless move.
Number 13. Edmund O'Brien had a drinking problem during production. Not severe, but enough that Lupino noticed. Some mornings he'd arrived a set slightly off, needing coffee and time before he could perform. Most directors would have confronted him, threatened him, maybe even replaced him. Lupino did something different. She rearranged the shooting schedule. She moved his heaviest emotional scenes to afternoons when he was sharper. She shot his simpler dialogue scenes in the mornings, and she never said a word about it. O'Brien didn't realize what she'd done until weeks later when he looked at the call sheets and noticed the pattern. He pulled her aside and apologized. Lupino just shrugged. "You showed up. You did the work. That's all that matters." O'Brien later said, that moment changed him, not because she called him out, but because she didn't. She saw him struggling and quietly built the production around it. That kind of directorial compassion was rare in 1953. It's rare now, and it's one reason the performance he gave in The Bigamist remains one of his most vulnerable, because Lupino didn't demand perfection. She created space for humanity, flaws and all. Number 14. The adoption agency scenes in the film weren't fictional. Lupino based them on real interviews with social workers who investigated prospective parents. In the 1950s, adoption was heavily scrutinized. Agencies didn't just check financial stability, they examined marriages, morality, personal history. One wrong answer could disqualify a couple permanently. Lupino researched this extensively. She spoke with adoption officials, read case files, attended interviews. What she discovered disturbed her. The process wasn't about finding good parents. It was about enforcing conformity. Couples were rejected for being too old, too poor, too unconventional. Single women weren't even considered. The system didn't protect children. It protected an ideal. So, when Lupino wrote the adoption investigation scenes, she made them uncomfortable. The social worker, played by Edmund Gwenn, asks invasive questions. He scrutinizes body language. He judges everything, and when Harry's double life is discovered, the adoption falls apart, not because he'd be a bad father, but because he failed to meet society's standards. Test audiences hated these scenes. They felt intrusive, judgmental, cold. Exactly Lupino's point. She wasn't making entertainment. She was holding up a mirror, and what audiences saw reflected back made them squirm. Number 15. The bus station scene near the end of the film, where Harry breaks down, wasn't in the original script. It was improvised during a location scout. Lupino and O'Brien were checking potential filming spots when they stumbled into an actual Greyhound station. It was late afternoon. The light was perfect. Travelers sat exhausted, waiting for buses that never seemed to arrive. Lupino looked at O'Brien and said, "This is where Harry falls apart." They didn't have cameras, they didn't have permits. But Lupino made a note and returned 3 days later with a skeleton crew. They shot it guerrilla style. Hidden cameras, no sound equipment, just O'Brien sitting on a bench surrounded by real people who had no idea they were in a movie. The breakdown is subtle. No tears, no screaming. Just a man staring at nothing, realizing he's lost everything. When the AB processed the footage, the crew was silent. It was the rawest moment in the entire film, and it happened because Lupino trusted instinct over planning. She didn't need a soundstage to capture truth. She just needed the right light and an actor willing to break. Number 16. After the film wrapped, Ida Lupino struggled to find work. Not because The Bigamist failed, because it succeeded in the wrong way. It made people uncomfortable. It asked questions Hollywood didn't want us asked. And it proved a woman could direct serious drama without male supervision. That terrified the studios more than any controversial subject matter. Lupino spent the next 2 years pitching projects, scripts about women, stories with moral complexity, films that didn't tie everything in a neat bow. Every studio passed. Too risky, too dark, too Lupino. So she pivoted to television, directing episodes of The Twilight Zone. Alfred Hitchcock presents The Fugitive. She became one of TV's most prolific directors, but she never got another theatrical feature. The Bigamist was her last film as director for a major release. It wasn't a failure that ended her career. It was success on her own terms. And Hollywood couldn't forgive that. Decades later, film scholars would call her one of the most important American directors of the 1950s. But in 1953, she was just a woman who'd gone too far. The industry didn't blacklist her officially, they just stopped calling. And the silence, that was punishment enough. Number 17. There's a moment in the film that almost nobody notices. Harry is driving between Los Angeles and San Francisco, the camera fixed on his face as landscapes blur past. No dialogue, no music, just a man alone with his thoughts. That shot lasts 43 seconds. In 1953, that was an eternity. Studios demanded constant action, snappy dialogue, quick cuts. Every second had to earn its place. Dead air was death. Silence meant audiences would walk out, demand refunds, tell their friends the movie was boring. But Lupino held the shot anyway. She wanted audiences to sit in Harry's silence, to feel the weight of secrets pressing down, the exhaustion of living two lives, the slow suffocation of guilt. The editor begged her to cut it down. 20 seconds, he said. 15. Give them something, anything. Test audiences complained it dragged, that nothing happened, that they didn't understand why the camera just sat there. But Lupino refused every suggestion. She said the discomfort is the point. If you can't sit with this man's silence for 43 seconds, how can you judge his choices? If you need constant entertainment, you're not ready for his truth. The shot stayed. And over time, it became one of the film's most discussed moments. Film students analyze it in editing classes. Directors reference it in interviews. Critics call it a masterclass in restraint. Because Lupino understood something fundamental, something Hollywood had forgotten in its race for spectacle. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Just hold the frame. Let the actor breathe. Let the audience sit in the uncomfortable quiet. Let them feel what can't be said. In a film about lies, deception, and fractured lives. That silence told the truth louder than any dialogue ever could. Number 18. The film's budget was so tight that Ida Lupino wore her own clothes on camera. Phyllis Martin's wardrobe, the simple dresses, the modest coat, all came from Lupino's personal closet. The production couldn't afford a costume designer, so Lupino raided her own wardrobe and Joan Fontaine's. They mixed and matched, shared accessories, made it work. Fontaine later joked that half the movie was costumed by their closets in a nearby thrift store, but the limitation created authenticity. Phyllis doesn't look like a Hollywood version of a working woman. She looks like an actual secretary in 1953, wearing clothes she could afford, mended and reworn. Same with Eve. Her outfits aren't glamorous. They're practical, appropriate, real. Modern audiences don't notice because it feels natural. But that naturalness was born from necessity. Lupino didn't have the budget for movie magic, so she used reality instead. And somehow, that made the characters more believable than any studio costume department ever could. When the film was preserved by the Library of Congress decades later, archivists noted the wardrobes as significant, not because they were beautiful, but because they were true. Number 19. The musical score almost didn't exist. The budget had no money for an original composition. Lupino planned to release the film with no music at all, just ambient sound and silence. But composer Leith Stevens heard about the project and offered to score it for almost nothing. He'd seen Lupino's previous films and believed in her vision, so he composed a minimal, haunting score using a small ensemble: piano, strings, sparse, and melancholic. He recorded it in 2 days, working nearly 20 hours straight. When Lupino heard the final mix, she wept. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because Stevens understood what she was trying to do. The music didn't manipulate emotion, it simply underscored what was already there. Pain, loneliness, consequence. In most films, music tells you how to feel. In The Bigamist, it just sits with you in the feeling. Stevens never asked for credit beyond his name in the titles. He never promoted it. He just did the work and walked away. Years later, when film composers studied his score, they marveled at its restraint. In an era of bombastic orchestration, Stevens proved less could devastate more, and he did it for almost free because he believed the film mattered. Number 20. Here's something nobody talks about. The Bigamist wasn't just Ida Lupino's last theatrical film as a director. It was also one of the last films produced entirely outside the studio system, before independent cinema collapsed in the late 1950s. The filmmakers, Lupino's production company, shut down shortly after. Not because of financial failure, but because distribution became impossible. Major studios controlled theaters. If they didn't want to screen your film, you had no audience. And studios didn't want films like The Bigamist. Too honest, too uncomfortable, too independent. So, the model died. Lupino moved to television. Other independent filmmakers gave up or got absorbed into studios. And for nearly a decade, American cinema became more controlled, more sanitized, more safe. It wasn't until the late 1960s, with directors like Cassavetes and Corman, that independent film clawed its way back. But Lupino had been there first, fighting the system, telling uncomfortable truths, proving it could be done. The Bigamist wasn't just a film about moral complexity. It was a monument to creative independence, and when the industry looked back decades later, they finally understood. She wasn't just making movies, she was fighting for the right to make them her way. Bonus fact. Years after The Bigamist faded from theaters, Ida Lupino gave a single interview about the film. She was in her 70s, long retired, mostly forgotten by Hollywood. The interviewer asked if she had regrets. Lupino thought for a long moment. Then she said, "I regret that people remember me as an actress first and a director second, because the work I'm most proud of, nobody saw." She wasn't bitter, just honest. The films she directed, particularly The Bigamist, never got the recognition they deserved in her lifetime. Critics dismissed them, studios ignored them, and history for a long time forgot them. But Lupino didn't need vindication. She'd done the work. told the stories, made the films nobody else would make. And that, she said, was enough. When she died in 1995, obituaries focused on her acting career. A few mentioned her directing, almost as a footnote. But in film schools, in archives, in the hearts of directors who discovered her work decades later, Ida Lupino became a legend. Not for what Hollywood gave her, but for what she took. The camera, the story, the truth, and she never gave it back.